Well, good morning. It is Tuesday, July 14th. Welcome as we gather once again for our morning devotions. This morning, our focus is going to be on Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. And as we do that, we're also going to look at where that touches us in our lives. I am Heather E. Clausen, pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church and the United Methodist Church, both in Herman, Minnesota. Paul, as many of us know, was a missionary who surprisingly, because of his background, became a force for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Previously, he had been one who persecuted the believers of what they saw as a threat in this new faith, feeling as if it was something that was against the true God. Paul was to find out it was not, and that was his Damascus Road experience, and from that time on, he became a force. And part of that force was the spreading of the teachings of Jesus and the building up of those who heard and responded, and the building up of the fledgling communities that began in the different places that he went. One of the communities he went to was called Galatia, and a believing community began, starting, of course, as they did with house churches, people gathering. And, of course, he couldn't stay there. But he had to continue the missionary work, continue traveling and going to many different communities. But he kept track of what was going on in the places that he had been. And he began to hear that there were serious problems in Galatia. And the serious problems related to believing that all that Jesus had done was enough. And so there were what we'll call opponents that came and began teaching that it was not enough, that there were things that believers needed to do, that they needed to add these layers of law to this freedom that we had in Jesus Christ. And they began pushing. You couldn't be a true follower. You couldn't be in this relationship with Jesus, this relationship with God through Jesus Christ, unless you did these other things. And one was circumcision, and one was following and understanding the whole teachings of the Jewish religion. And it began to be, obviously, you can imagine, a conflict, because not all that became new believers came from a Jewish background. And so Paul wrote this teaching to confront those who now were trying to make all that Jesus had done as if, as humans, we could do more to ensure our salvation. And he wanted them to understand that the good news was independent of human authority. But he also wanted them to understand what faith was. If you didn't have to do all these other things, if you didn't have to follow these rules and authorities, what was the faith and what did it mean? And so the teaching in Galatians is very much teaching we need to hear today, because it is a reminder that the way in which we are known to truly follow the teachings of Jesus has nothing to do with layers of authority, has nothing to do with rules and regulations. And most particularly in the verses that we're going to share this morning that probably many people know even outside of church practice. He made it very clear that it will be known by the fruits of your life and your work and your conversations and your caring acts, that it was that virtue that supported the deep foundational teaching of Jesus about loving one another. So I'm going to read these two verses from Galatians 5. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And I'm reading on just a little bit. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. It is words we need to hear today, isn't it? Sometimes in the midst of life, we lose sight of that. And sometimes in community of believers, it becomes about rules and regulations. You need to believe this, you need to say this, you need to do this. When, quite simply, living out the law of love will show in our lives. Living out that presence, that abiding presence of Christ in all of us, will show in our life, in our actions, and again in our conversations. I remember back when I was in seminary, they had us read a book called Common Decency. And it seemed so obvious. And yet it isn't, is it? You know, sometimes I grieve that we have lost this sense of common decency. And as it says in Galatians, let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. The grief that I feel, and many of you feel, comes from conversation that seems to be to make a point, to be right, and to win. And definitely not to listen. These are the fruits that this relationship with Jesus Christ should bear. Let me share them again. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And common decency is meaning that we even do the simple things of caring for someone else's time. If you're not going to be able to be someplace when you have said you would be, or even be there at all, common decency says you let someone know. But common decency goes much deeper. And in that decency, it isn't avoiding conversation, it isn't avoiding topics, but it's how we receive them and how we receive what others believe. How willing are we to listen? How willing are we to hear something we disagree with? And how willing are we to even understand that somewhere in that may be a kernel of truth that God is trying to teach us? Because God often speaks to us in surprising ways. And you know, sometimes we're not going to get it right. We're going to say things that we regret. And the other part of that, to live out those fruits of the Spirit, means that it is up to us to repair that. Dr. Harriet Lerner wrote a book called Why Won't You Apologize? She had 9 essentials, and I want to share those with you this morning. The apology, number 1, the apology does not include the word but. Oh, how often has that happened? I'm really sorry, but you know you made me mad. I'm really sorry. Stop. Number 2, keeps the focus on your actions and not on the other person's response. We can only be responsible for our own actions. And we cannot make our decisions on how we respond based on whether someone else does or not. We need to be the ones that display those fruits. Number 3, includes an offer of reparation or restitution that fits the situation. Might be as simple as, what can I do to make this better? Could we have that conversation again? Could we try again? Whatever it is, to create the opportunity, not to insist, but to create the opportunity. Number 4, does not overdo. You don't have to apologize 50 times. But the apology that you give needs to be sincere and be obvious in your behavior and your attitude. It's not like the little kids that you say, tell your brother or your sister you're sorry. I'm sorry. Not very real, is it? It needs to be real, but not overdone. It's not their responsibility for what you need to do. So make it clear and make it authentic. Number 5, and this is the challenging one of the many, doesn't get caught up in who's more to blame or who started it. Wow. That's not easy, but it makes sense, doesn't it? Does it really matter how it began? What matters is the pain that it caused. And we need to take responsibility for our part in it, even if the other person never does. Number 6. Here we go again. Requires that you do your best to avoid a repeat performance. That does mean listening to our response. What was it in the conversation that triggered us? Our responsibility then is to examine that and do the work that we need to not be triggered and to avoid that repeat performance. Number 7, should not serve to silence. Let the other person have their say. You might not like it. Or you might. A dynamic might change in the relationship. Number 8, and this requires pre-thought. Shouldn't be offered to make you feel better if it risks making the hurt party feel worse. You know, a lot of things, the learning we have to do is it isn't all about us. Oh, sure, we know when we've messed up. We want to feel better about it. But that's our work. That's not their responsibility, and we need to reflect. My saying something, is that serving me or serving them or serving us both? And if it's only serving me and you know it's going to create more pain in the other person, then at that time it's best to refrain. Number 9, does not ask the hurt party to do anything, not even to forgive. Can you hear in those fruits of the Spirit? What we do, how we behave with one another, how courteous we are, how authentic we are, how real we are, comes from that abiding presence of Jesus Christ. And it means we need to listen to it. We've been focusing on contemplation. Sometimes that means taking that time aside, stopping and listening. And often in that listening, we might hear what needs to be done in a specific situation. Reflection is important. If we act quickly, if we knee-jerk, if we jump too fast, we know that the healing will not happen. What needs to change in our world today is to understand it's not always about us. We don't have to win. We don't have to always be right. We don't have to ask others to make us feel better. That's the work we can do with God ourselves. And when we understand that there is an action, a loving action, that we can take, such as an apology, then we do that. Not to sculpt a certain response from the other person, but because we know it is the most loving and right thing to do. That book that I read many years ago called Common Decency reflected all of that. It is being courteous. It is being respectful. But it's more than that. We can play those behaviors. But how we interact with others needs to come from a deeper, deeper place. That deep place where we encounter Jesus. Using that guidance, as Paul shared in this letter we call the book of Galatians, what he wanted to remind them is we have what we need in Jesus Christ. We don't need external rules. We don't need to do certain things to be accepted. We are accepted. That's already there. But it's out of that acceptance and out of that love that we need to allow God to work within us to become more and more and more a model of the teachings and the behavior of Jesus. So today, take some time. Reflect. Is there an apology that you owe? And yes, it takes courage to do so. And it takes courage to let go of expectations that it will be received graciously and full healing will come, but it's a beginning. Everything that we can do to reflect those fruits of the Spirit will go a long way towards healing, towards even changing the world. Maybe it's one relationship at a time, but the work is well worth doing. Spend some time and let God speak to you. Go in peace. Amen.